welcome back. This is our final video on Chapter 9, Reproduction and Development. Once again, I'm Miss Delia, and if you're ready, let's get started. As you know, we have already finished 9.1 to 9.3, and in this video, we're going to go into the roles of hormones during pregnancy and parturition. As you may have guessed, this segment would also be divided into two, which is the first one on pregnancy and the second one on parturition. No worries, they will both be in the same video. So let's first look at the roles of hormones during pregnancy. I hope that by the end of the lesson, you will be able to explain the roles of hormones during pregnancy, especially on progesterone, estrogen, and the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. For this part of the lesson, we will be using these few diagrams to facilitate our understanding. So the first of these diagrams is this flowchart that shows which cells or which tissues are secreting the hormones that are relevant to this part of the pregnancy. The second diagram that we'll look at is this one. So it shows the developing embryo inside of the womb, as well as the hormones that are being secreted. And down there, you would see a graph that shows the increasing or decreasing levels of HCG, progesterone, or estrogen at different points of the pregnancy. Last but not least, we'll also use this diagram right here, which maps out the levels of estrogen and progesterone during a cycle, as well as the thickness of the endometrium corresponding to the levels of hormones. Now, let us continue with the lesson and look at what happens in the womb during the first trimester. So, as you notice down here over on the right-hand side, you have a graph that shows the different blood levels of hormones, which are for hormones HCG, progesterone, estrogen, and also oxytocin. It's mapped out to the age of the embryo and also points out the points of fertilization and the birth. So in the first trimester, after implantation, the trophoblast cells of blastocysts will start to secrete HCG, also called the human chorionic gonadotropin. HCG will maintain the corpus luteum and prevents disintegration of the corpus luteum. In the absence of HCG, corpus luteum would disintegrate, progesterone levels would drop, resulting in menstruation and loss of embryo. So if we look at this diagram once again, what happens is at implantation, trophoblast cells of the blastocyst secrete HCG. HCG will maintain the corpus luteum, make sure it doesn't disintegrate, and so corpus luteum can continue to secrete estrogens and progesterone. HCG stimulates the corpus luteum to grow and to continue secretion of estrogen and progesterone. Why do you think that needs to be done? The reason for HCG to stimulate the corpus luteum is so that the corpus luteum would continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone to maintain the thickening of endometrial lining for embryonic development. Right now, corpus luteum is the one that will produce estrogen and progesterone. So in this diagram right here, corpus luteum continues to secrete these hormones, and they maintain the endometrium lining. If corpus luteum does not secrete progesterone and estrogen, or if we say the trophoblast is not there to simulate the corpus luteum with HCG, this is what would happen. This is the level of progesterone if there is no fertilization and no HCG from the trophoblast. That means the corpus luteum will eventually die, and it will stop secreting progesterone and estrogen, and the endometrium would shed. So, by having the trophoblast secrete HCG, we maintain the thickness of the endometrium. As you look at this chart, the levels of progesterone is higher than the levels of estrogen. High levels of progesterone will prevent miscarriage and maintain the pregnancy. The HCG levels will increase dramatically during the first trimester, and at the end of the first trimester, the placenta will take over the roles of the corpus luteum. The placenta will in turn secrete estrogen and progesterone. And we can see the context of that text being illustrated here. As you see, the blue line of progesterone is constantly higher than estrogen during the first trimester. Those are being secreted by corpus luteum. The trophoblast continues to secrete large amounts of HCG and will be very, very high in the first trimester. At the end of the first trimester, placenta will slowly take over the role of corpus luteum and start to secrete its own progesterone and estrogen. And that brings us to the second trimester, which is from the 4th to the 6th month. This is the middle of the pregnancy. The hormone levels will stabilize and HCG secretion will decline. And therefore, the corpus luteum will deteriorate. The placenta will completely take over the production of estrogen and progesterone, and the levels of progesterone is still maintained to be higher than estrogen. If the levels of estrogen becomes higher, this could cause miscarriage because estrogen would induce uterus contraction. So let's have a look at this diagram again. So by the second trimester, these HCG levels would be lowered and the corpus luteum will start to disintegrate. That means the developed placenta will now take over the role to secrete estrogen and progesterone to maintain and also increase thickness of the endometrium. So what's the function of progesterone in the second trimester? The first is progesterone functions to maintain the pregnancy and to prevent premature birth. The second function is to inhibit the secretion of prolactin and oxytocin, so it prevents lactation until after birth. Prolactin is a hormone that stimulates the mammary glands or the breasts to produce breast milk. Oxytocin is a multi-purpose love hormone, but one of its functions is to stimulate mammary glands to produce breast milk too. So by having progesterone, we put that off until after birth. So that's what happens here in the second trimester. HCG levels will deteriorate or decrease, the corpus luteum would disintegrate, and progesterone and estrogen will be mainly produced by the placenta. Moving on to the third trimester, which is from the 7th to the 9th month. In the final weeks of pregnancy, estrogen will reach its highest level, and it will simulate the formation of oxytocin receptors on the uterus. Progesterone levels will drop off and simulate the beginning of contraction that will lead to birth. So that is what is going to be happening here. As you can see, at the very end, estrogen will reach its peak, and this will kick off the process for birth. I would like to point out that this diagram is a bit more confusing because the timeline is different compared to this diagram. To help you understand how estrogen and progesterone levels can lead to birth in the end of the third trimester, I would like you to prefer using this diagram. Diagram ini lebih sesuai untuk bantu kamu faham macam mana level estrogen bila dia semakin tinggi daripada progesterone boleh menyebabkan wanita itu untuk start beranak. Okay, so this diagram here very simply, very quickly summarizes the roles of hormones during pregnancy. Now let us move on to the next segment and talk about the roles of hormones during parturition, proses beranak. So you should be able to explain the roles of hormones during parturition or birth process by referring to these four hormones. So here we also have another flowchart that starts with estrogen, and we also see oxytocin, prostaglandins, and a positive feedback loop. So let's have a look at this step by step. First, we're going to have a look at the diagram that I pointed out at the end of that first segment. Remember, we like to use this diagram because it is easier to help you understand. So this is the same thing. I've only cropped out the diagram. The blue line is for progesterone levels, the green line is for estrogen, and the red line is for HCG. As you can see, in the final week of pregnancy, estrogen will reach its highest level, which is the green line, and this will simulate formation of oxytocin receptors on the uterus. This is the uterus. This change in the hormone levels will cause there to be increased oxytocin receptors on uterus. Then the progesterone level drops off, which will simulate the beginning of contraction that will lead to birth. Oxytocin will be released by the fetus and the mother's posterior pituitary gland, which is in each of their brains. This will simulate uterus contraction or a powerful contraction on the smooth muscles of the uterus. Oxytocin, in this case, causes contraction. Oxytocin will also simulate the placenta to secrete prostaglandins. So oxytocin goes there and it simulates the placenta, which is the gray part here, to secrete prostaglandins, shown here in the orange arrows, which will then simulate even more contraction of the uterus. The physical and emotional stresses of the mother during this whole process will simulate further release of oxytocin and prostaglandins. More oxytocin and prostaglandins means that there would be even more contractions. Both oxytocin and prostaglandins induces and regulates contractions of the uterus. Action of oxytocin and prostaglandins will form a positive feedback loop. What is positive feedback loop? It is when hormones cause a condition to intensify. As the condition intensifies, hormone production increase. Jadi dua hormon ini, oxytocin dengan prostaglandin, dia akan menyebabkan contraction. Okay, rahim itu mengecut, dia mengetat, contract. And oxytocin and prostaglandin plus this contraction forms a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loop means satu benda meningkat, dia akan menyebabkan benda kedua meningkat. Benda kedua akan menyebabkan benda pertama semakin meningkat, benda pertama semakin meningkat, benda kedua pun meningkat. Jadi meningkat, 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 meningkat. That is positive feedback loop. These uterine contractions simulate the secretion of more oxytocin and prostaglandins. Bila rahim itu mengecut, mengetat, dia kompres, dia menyebabkan lebih banyak oksitosin dan prostaglandin dihasilkan, which in turn simulates further contractions. Semakin banyak oksitosin dan prostaglandin, rahim semakin lagi contract. Semakin contract, banyak oksitosin. Banyak oksitosin, semakin contract. So it continues and continues and continues and continues. So if we go back to this diagram, let's have a look again at this diagram and the roles of hormones during parturition. We start with estrogen being secreted by the placenta. And when that estrogen becomes higher than progesterone, it induces oxytocin receptors on the uterus. At the same time, progesterone levels decrease, and that simulates the beginning of contraction in the uterus and leads to birth. At the same time, oxytocin is constantly being released by the posterior pituitary glands of the mother and also of the fetus. And oxytocin binds to oxytocin receptors on the uterus. This will simulate powerful contraction on the smooth muscle of uterus. So sini oxytocin menyebabkan contraction. At this point, oxytocin will also simulate the placenta to secrete prostaglandins. Oxytocin suruh placenta hasilkan prostaglandin. Prostaglandin will simulate more contractions on uterus. So the uterus contracts even more. And this contributes to the positive feedback loop. More contractions on uterus means that more oxytocin, because contraction makes the mother stressed. The mother stressed, brain tries to produce more oxytocin to help the mother out. More oxytocin means more contraction. Looking at the second arrow, more contractions on uterus also simulates the placenta to secrete even more prostaglandins. Even more prostaglandins means even more contraction of uterus. So this positive feedback loop will continue again and again and again until the baby is pushed out, which is what we know as the birth process. So yeah, that's it. That's how you look at this flowchart to look at the roles of hormones during parturition. So we focus more on estrogen, oxytocin, and prostaglandins, a little bit on progesterone. So very quick summary of what we learned in this subtopic. We talked about the roles of hormones during pregnancy. We divide that into the first, second, and third trimester. During pregnancy, we focus on HCG, progesterone, and estrogen levels, keeping in mind what are the roles of the trophoblast, corpus luteum, and the placenta during this pregnancy. When we talk about roles of hormones during parturition, we talk more about estrogen, progesterone, oxytocin, and prostaglandins. Remember that there is a positive feedback loop involved in the birth process. So make sure you take note of where the contractions start and how does that contribute to the positive feedback loop. That brings us to the end of this subtopic and the end of this chapter. So what can you do now? Now you can make your own notes for the roles of hormones during pregnancy and parturition, and then please complete all tutorial questions for Chapter 9 that you haven't completed yet, especially for that Part B question 3 structure question. That's all from me for this lesson. I'll see you again soon. Thank you and happy learning. Bye!